My name is Paul Nunes-Dier. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Daughters, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to be here again with all of you and, of course, our guest speakers for today. Right, Martin?
Absolutely, Judy and Penny, you're most welcome. It's lovely to meet both of you, and Judy, to see you again. You've been with us before.
Indeed. Hello.
And the theme of today's conversation is something that I'm sure you're all excited to learn more about. How coaching and particular executive coaching can impact meeting performance and meeting productivity. So that's the theme we have here. Our guest speakers were chosen based on their competence, their relevance for the subject, right? But we normally start these conversations by asking a question. Martin, maybe you can proceed now.
Yeah, and again, I've said this before, Paul, not always best received by some of our guests. So guys, feel free to disagree with the question that I'm asking. But we normally ask our participants if there's something about yourself, your background, your passions, your interests that people generally may not be aware of. If there's anything that wouldn't be that commonly known about you.
Nearly everything about me is not commonly known. So here's something that's not commonly known to me. I recently did a whole 3 hours of assessments about my neurodiversity as part of a thing that a company I work with was doing for all its staff, and I'm waiting to find out what the result was. It was really, really hard, and I noticed that as a consultant, as a fairly freelance consultant, I've basically stopped doing some of the things that I find really difficult, presumably because my neurology is not lined up that way.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten that I wasn't doing them anymore. It was really interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm waiting. Tomorrow I get to find out what label is going to be stamped on my neurodiversity.
Oh wow,
that's fascinating.
And Judy, how does that feel? Are you curious, frightened? What's
both? Yeah, I'm very curious because I've always known that I was not normal, but then maybe all of us think we're not normal.
Oh yeah, for sure. My wife thinks that about me all the time. So. Wow. Kenny, any thoughts come to mind?
Well, a bit like Judy's answer. I mean, I've got no idea what's widely known about me. That feels slightly uncomfortable to imagine that anything might be widely known about me.
Yeah.
But something that I've started doing maybe over the last 5 or 6 years with my husband, now that we are empty nesters, although in fact one of our kids has come back home because it's the boomerang generation, and
Yeah.
rents are so high. But our sort of empty nest project is to walk around the coast of England and Wales, and
Oh,
we've
wow.
done about 2,500 miles over the last 5 or 6 years, and that's many miles of it kind of just being the two of us, or sometimes if we're not actually walking together because we're just going at different paces,
Yeah.
just alone with my own thoughts and the sea on my left, which
Fantastic. Oh, I
yeah.
love that idea, Penny.
Yeah, brilliant.
And how would that connect to meeting performance in coaching?
Well, that's a question. I think one of the things that I've really liked about it is that the rules, if you like, that we've set for ourselves mean that we have walked through some really horrible areas that you would never normally go to if you weren't kind of working there. We've walked around landfill sites, nuclear power stations, military sites, industrial estates, bits of the coast that are falling into the sea. So I suppose there's something about welcoming the difficult or less pleasant or interesting, well, they're all fascinating actually, but maybe the less pleasant parts of the processes that we go through, as well as the high points.
Yeah.
And it's not all about the highest point on the coast or seeing dolphins, which we've seen once in the 2,500 miles, or the beautiful sunlight on the sea. Sometimes it's about trudging through the mud, crawling through a culvert. Oh goodness me, yes, those kind of unexpected things that actually then feel quite satisfying to have done, but sometimes they just feel a bit dull and you think, I'm really glad that's over. But you have to do it to get to the next bit. Maybe there's something there.
There's, Penny, as you're saying that, there's a metaphor that you've conjured visually some things in my mind there, and there's a metaphor for kind of adversity versus Judy, the point you made there about avoiding things that we would prefer not to be doing. And your point there, Penny, about we can set rules for ourselves that will kind of bring us or force us to go into things that we may not be too comfortable with, but we might get benefit from. But just before we came live on air, Judy, we were talking about metaphors, and we were talking about clear language. And I confessed I've never heard of clear language. Is that a segue, Judy, to ground us right into immediately from your shared stories?
Well, we were talking about clean language.
Clean language, yes.
Which is one of the topics that people tend to ask me about, because I'm the co-author of a book on the topic, Clean Language, Revealing Metaphors and Opening Minds. But it's an interesting segue, because clean language is a precision inquiry methodology, which helps people find out what other people mean by what they say, and even helps people find out what they themselves mean by what they say. It's really good for discovering tacit knowledge and that kind of thing, where people don't really know what they know, and these questions can gently get to the heart of things very rapidly. But they're not particularly good questions for going where people actively don't want to go. We often say one of the situations not to use clean language is when you're interviewing a hostile witness who is actively trying not to tell you something. But that's not to say that in a lot of situations, people would be willing to tell you about things if you would only be interested and listen and ask. And that's one of the relevances between clean language and executive meetings, I would say. Because a lot of the time I observe people trying to force meetings to go in a particular direction where they think they need to go. But actually the other people in the meeting may not want it to go there, or may not realize why it's wanted to go there, etc., etc., etc. And there's not enough space for everybody's voices to be heard. And the clean language questions can be extremely relevant there. I was talking to a group of managers in actually the BBC yesterday, and we were talking about how they can use these questions to find out what the other people in the meeting might mean, and therefore reveal what people actually want, not what you as the boss think they ought to want.
So is it a series of specific questions, or is it a style of questioning, Judy?
It's more of the first than the second, but it is both.
Okay.
So the classic 2 clean language questions that I always share when I'm doing a demonstration or a talk about it is what kind of X, and is there anything else about X, where X stands for one or more of the other person's words.
Yeah. Okay.
So if we were talking about, if you had been talking about a meeting, I could ask, what kind of meeting? Is there anything else about that meeting?
Yeah.
That's deep. That's deep. Penny, do you use clean language as a toolbox?
Well, I not consciously. I mean, not with. I wouldn't claim to be using clean language. I'm not sort of trained in the methodology. I haven't read Judy's book, but perhaps it will be finding its way onto my bookshelves. But those kinds of questions, definitely I use them in meetings when I'm facilitating, and I use them in coaching when I'm working one-to-one with people. And I love to pick up on people's metaphors as well and use those kinds of questions to help people expand on their metaphors. And I also like to ask what people see around them when they imagine themselves within their metaphor, and what's behind them, what's in front of them. I try to get a little bit of embodiment into it as well, even though we may only be speaking about the physical manifestations. But when you think about what's behind you, what do you feel in your body, or what you think about what's in front of you, what do you feel? And the metaphor of a journey and of time flowing from behind you to in front of you is very deeply ingrained in our culture, but it's not the only way of thinking about it. So I also try to notice if people are using slightly other ways of thinking about where they might be situated in a metaphorical landscape and where they might be situated with regards to time. And people often, one of the things that groups often don't realize that they don't agree about is what they mean by slightly vague phrases like short-term, medium-term, long-term, and things like that. So I try to help a group listen to each other about what their interpretation of words like that are. And sometimes I try to oblige them to pick an actual specific timescale to force out this whether or not there's agreement about what's meant by it.
Disagreement about vague terms is a really lovely place to use things like clean language questions. We had an example yesterday. One of the guys who came to this event was saying that he'd had this really awful meeting in the morning, and it turned out that there was a massive misunderstanding about what was meant by testing and what was meant by launch and what was meant by live. Different groups of people who were in the meeting had completely different understandings of those 3 terms.
And was it a case that is it a case in general, just picking up your point, Penny, is it a case that people use language like this in meetings, don't have a shared understanding of what we're talking about, but assume that we do? And because of that, we have people talking past each other and now disagreeing when actually they don't even know what they're disagreeing about, because we don't have a shared...
Or even agreeing and not realizing that actually they don't agree.
We disagree,
which is kind of also really fascinating. So people are quite happy. They leave the meeting happy, and then they don't understand why it is that other people seem to be going back on what they've agreed to, when in fact they've agreed to different things. It's and I think that's one of the things that when you're a process facilitator and you're trying as much as possible, it's not always I'm not sure it's ever possible to be 100% this, but you're trying to step away from the content, not be attached to what the specific outcome is of the meeting, but pay attention to the process, then you can spot that more easily kind of in the moment. But also, you know, you build up a stock of experience. Oh, this looks like it might be this kind of false agreement, or this looks like it might be this kind of typical misunderstanding, where actually people, I often use the phrase, well, when it happens, I sometimes use the phrase in meetings, I observe that the group seems to be furiously agreeing with each other. And that's a little, you know, it's a little joke, but it's also a way of testing, you know, is that actually what's going on here at the moment? And sometimes it is. It's the enthusiasm of everyone wanting to confirm that they agree with what they think is the point, decision point or observation about the world that they've come up with, and that can be an exciting moment in a group, and people get enthusiastic about it, and then it can go, and then, you know, again, as a process facilitator, I don't know how time pressured some of the meetings are that you find yourselves in, but I'm sometimes looking at my watch or the clock or whatever and thinking, okay, how long am I going to let this go on for before we need to move on to the next thing that this group has said that they wanted to do in the time that they've got?
I call that one, Penny. I've used that many times myself. I call it violent agreement.
Oh, okay.
And I normally say to the group, when I start to feel there's violent agreement happening, I feel the need to jump in and disrupt, just to confirm either, yes, we are in real agreement, or actually we're missing each other and we're missing something. But I've never come across clear language as a way, or clean language as a way that, so there's a methodology to kind of bottom that out a little bit forensically, Judy. Would that be a fair way to characterize it?
A little bit forensically.
Gently.
And one of the ways that it's interesting, if you're an outsider as a facilitator, is, and I've been guilty of falling into this trap. I tend to assume that when the group uses jargon terms,
they understand it.
They know what they're talking about. But actually, that some of those are the best ones to ask a couple of questions about. I mean, things like launch in an organization that launches all the time ought to be agreed terminology, you'd think, but they're just not.
But it's not,
But it's even worse if you know there's some jargon phrase. One organization I'm working with at the moment uses the jargon phrase BCT. Now, as it goes, BCT is a particular machine in a factory. So the physical object, everybody knows what BCT refers to. Turns out that nobody knows what BCT stands for. It's something Kraft Turner, but nobody can remember what the B is.
Well, that sorry, Judy, you look like you wanted to carry on.
No, go on.
Well, I was going to say that makes me think about where organizational memory sits, actually, which is taking us in a different tangent. So I don't know if you are happy for us to kind of go there.
Absolutely. No, the conversation will go where it goes, Penny, for sure.
So there's an organisation, a public body in the UK that I've been working with over the course of maybe 15 years, including some projects, because it works on very large, long-term projects, some projects that have been going on for kind of all of that time. And as an external consultant who keeps kind of reasonable records, as you can tell from my bookshelf, I'm a little bit of a keeper. I wouldn't say that I'm a hoarder, but I do like to keep things. I remember things or hold institutional memory that the organisation should be holding, and I find that slightly nerve-wracking, actually, as a citizen. You know, I feel like the institutional memory shouldn't be held by these random external consultants, and that there should be better ways of retaining that knowledge inside client organisations.
It's a real challenge, though, isn't it? My near neighbour just up the hill from me was complaining on this subject only the other day about the local council here. She's in her 90s, and she said every time a new councillor comes on and they think they're going to solve the problem of the handrail over there, and they don't know why it is as it is, and nobody ever comes and asks me because I know why that handrail is that way.
Yeah.
And it'll cost them a whole lot more money if they try and investigate again how to fix the handrail. I know why it's like that. And you're right, there is no institutional memory in a lot of local authorities, certainly. And in large organizations, it just disappears. There's nowhere to hold it.
Why is that? What's the underlying cause of that?
Well, I mean, there's a very obvious one, which is just turnover of staff.
Yeah.
That actually, you know, however good your knowledge management systems are,
yeah,
there are kind of commons, and they have to be actively managed, and you have to have an incentive for kind of inputting into a knowledge management system.
Yeah.
And staff move on either within the organization or to a new organization, and memory is lost, knowledge is lost, and relationships are lost. And I also, a lot of the work I do is public and stakeholder engagement in order that decisions or projects are better
informed.
And one of the kind of justifications that we use in training, I do capacity building and training inside organizations on these topics. One of the justifications we use for talking to people before you make the decision, rather than just talking to people afterwards in order to sell them the decision, or possibly sell them the decision in a more sophisticated way that makes them think as if they're being consulted, which is the kind of biggest waste of time. I say to people that, you know, there is knowledge out there. Oh, excuse me. There is knowledge out there, and you'd be surprised. You will be surprised that people know things that you need to know. And you can do all the desk studies and commission all the consultants that you like, but you do need to ask people. You need to ask Judy's neighbour about the handrail, and it will shortcut things. You'll be making your decisions based on much better information.
Yeah, but can I challenge the group here for a moment, Martin?
Absolutely.
Because we are thinking about organizational memory as something that could be important to keep and a good thing to have, right? But how about thinking on organizational toxic memories that can actually hinder any will of changing things from the newcomers, right? Because we have to follow what was always done so far. So how about thinking every time there's a fresh start and forget about what we learned in the past? Could this bring more creative solutions for the problems we have?
Well, that is a really great challenge. I'm going to have a bit of a think about that.
Yeah. I'd have to think about that as well. I can immediately see pluses and minuses to that. You know, and maybe the challenge is to have, it's not an either or question. Maybe the challenge is to have both in the right sequence at the right time with the right people, in order to, Penny, to your point, in order to get the best information at the right time in the decision-making process. Maybe that's where the challenge is. But could I put a kind of related but slightly different question back? So what are we missing in our executive meetings? If we've talked about the possibility of the language being used is not shared. They're the same words with different meanings. In my head, that's the same as an Irish-speaking person talking to a German-speaking person, and the words sound very similar and guttural, but actually two completely sets of meaning. So what are we missing in our executive meetings then that could improve our situation? Judy, shoot.
Can I throw into the conversation a quote that I read for the first time yesterday from David Marquet, who wrote a book called Leadership is Language. He posted it on LinkedIn yesterday. I think it's probably in the book. This quote: "Driving consensus is an act of coercion. Inviting dissent is an act of collaboration." And I found that really, really interesting, because I think that so many meetings appear to be about driving consensus. or trying to get consensus for all the reasons. I mean, nobody wants to step up and say, I am making this decision on the behalf of everybody, because that feels really bad and uncomfortable. So of course, we need to get consensus where everybody agrees. But actually, if we are constantly seeking consensus, we are absolutely cutting across all the voices that, everything else being equal, would have spoken out about the history, or about the future, or about the possibilities, or about the misunderstandings. Whereas if we could be okay with inviting dissent and saying, I want to hear the dissent, and then I will still make the decision, or I will actually make the decision. I won't pretend that the group is making the decision.
Absolutely.
I will make the decision.
I think there's something really important about the time that's allowed for conversations. I hate the idea of the phrase of driving consensus. I talk with groups about discovering consensus. So let's inquire into and discover where we agree and where we disagree, and understand better how, what it is that we disagree about and what lies behind that. Understand better what it is that we agree about. If time is tight, people jump to the kind of decision. If we imagine meetings as following kind of a diamond shape, so they open out, and then there's a kind of more or less longer or shorter phase of exploration, and then maybe they come to some kind of a resolution at the end. Maybe not a single meeting, maybe a process. If that's the kind of a shape of a meeting that we might imagine. People want to jump straight to the end. There's an anxiety about time and jumping straight to the end. And if people say that a meeting has been, one of the ways that people talk about meetings being unsatisfactory is that actually we ended the meeting. The cutoff point was when we were still kind of in the exploratory phase. It was just a talking shop kind of thing. And it's about time, and it's very hard to shortcut that. I mean, you maybe can do it in a group that knows each other very well and has a very healthy working dynamic, but it's hard to shortcut that. And I when I'm training facilitators, one of the things that we explore is the tension that you feel as the person running the meeting as you're in that exploratory phase. People call it the groan zone, but I like to think of it as the adventure forest. You don't quite know what's there, but perhaps you could enjoy it. I've heard people talk about it as the marmalade zone as well. It's kind of sticky, and maybe there are a few kind of little nuggets there, but that helping a group stay with the tension of not knowing for longer, so that they can properly hear each other about what it is that they don't know or don't agree about. And there are some tools for that. Kind of like exercise type tools or structural tools, in addition to approaches like clean language, which I think can really help a group. Really simple things like, maybe there are some clear options and you've got a flip chart or equivalent. Your particular stationery choices may vary, and you've got two columns: what I like about this idea, what I don't like about this idea. And you're not inviting people yet to say which is their preferred idea, but you are inviting people to explore, and you can put different questions. What makes me excited about this idea, what my concerns are, what the pitfalls are that we would need to overcome if we were going to make this a reality, what the questions are that we would need to answer before we choose, or something like that. So you can prompt different ways of thinking about each of the options, and then there are classics like the 6 thinking hats and that kind of thing, where you're inviting a group to say that all 6 of these ways of thinking about this question are useful and welcome. And if you habitually wear one of these hats, if you're always the negative person, then that's welcome, and experiment as well with finding the things you like about the idea, or so on. And that actually, as a group, in exploring this topic, we need to honour and give time to all of these different lenses, as well as what's going on in each person's head about it.
Yeah.
And welcome the idea, or not be afraid of the idea, that actually you may not have a clear view yet about what the best way forward is, and the fact that you may have you might be in two minds about it as a participant in the meeting, or as a leader in the meeting. That's fine. You know, why wouldn't you be?
That exact instance there, Penny, that you reference, is that where the personalities of particularly the leaders can significantly help or significantly hinder the ability of the group to produce their best work? So if I'm of a personality type that likes to push, that demands the answer now so that we can move on to the next item, I'm never likely to give the groan zone enough time to unstick. Pardon my mixing of metaphors, but I think you understand my point.
Yes.
So is that a significant factor, the personality piece?
Possibly. I mean, that feels outside of my competence to kind of talk about, because that feels like that's a particular field of expertise.
Yeah.
But definitely your assumptions about what it means to be playing the role that you're playing, maybe as an executive, as a organizational leader, organizational culture as well. So something that's bigger than the individual, but shapes and is shaped by the individuals in the organization. Absolutely. And I think there are big questions of hierarchy as well, in those conversations, either kind of structural hierarchy that's based on kind of privilege to do with one's own kind of identity in relation to the other identities that are in the conversation. And that kind of power balancing, again, is another kind of classic role of the facilitator.
Judy, could I ask you that I love that quote. That quote that you gave us, I think, is hugely powerful. Driving consensus is an act of coercion, but you said inviting dissent is an act of, and I can't remember that.
Collaboration.
Can you talk us through that in a wee bit more detail? Because I think that's really powerful.
I think that Penny's right, and that David has carefully chosen the word driving consensus.
Yeah.
Because of course, if there is consensus, finding it is great.
Yeah.
But I think it's more interesting than that. I think by exposing the fact that consensus is not necessarily the ideal. That's the bit that's caught my attention at the moment.
Yeah.
Because I sit through so many and have sat through so many meetings where it is not clear at all who is in charge of taking a decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that it's a culture, it's a behavior that is common in many organizations, is to hide whose job it is to make the decisions. And I think if we can get greater clarity on that point, then a whole bunch of meetings would be much, 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 much richer, because they would have clarity that you've been invited to give your opinion ahead of somebody else making a decision. But then you get invited to meetings that start out being two people, and with two people, two people together can make a decision. That's great. We can do that together. 20 people together trying to make a decision, absolutely not a prayer.
But we can create the illusion that we have made a decision, and sometimes that illusion might be called consensus.
So that illusion is how an awful lot of organizations are run, by the illusion of consensus. But actually what's happening is that voices are being silenced, information is being suppressed, and the quality of what the organization is doing is falling as a result.
I love, Penny, I love your choice of words, discovering consensus. I love that concept. Could I add in, there's two words that I've held on to from my primary degree about 25 years ago, which was constructive discontent. And again, it's a simple phrase that sounds like it's an oxymoron, but actually it goes to that idea of inviting dissent in order to build collaboration. But does that not take us actually back to the very beginning of the idea of clean language? Does it, you know, that as part of the grown zone, is it really to try and bottom out our shared understanding of the words we're using? And if we can get to that shared understanding, we'll expose two things. We'll expose what we are agreeing on, and we'll expose what we are not agreeing on. And that then gives us the possibility to say, let's park what we're agreeing on, because we've agreed, but now let's do another little bit of work on what we're not agreeing on and where that is. That a fair summary or analysis, or am I missing something here?
I guess, Judy, that was a question about clean language. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds good to me. And the truth is that once you start to really get into using these kinds of clean language questions, you discover that no two people ever agree on anything.
Absolutely.
To any level of detail. So everything is an approximation when it comes to agreement between two people. But what's lovely about that is the idea that it's okay for people to be different. And we can still get stuff done even when we only agree up to about a 50% approximation. Doesn't stop us cracking on. I'm working with a colleague friend in America on an event we're running in the end of the year. We decided a theme, clean to go. And it wasn't until we started to work on the logo together that I realized that she had in mind hyphenated to go, because she wanted to make it really spelt out that this was about takeaway, and she had a logo that involved takeaway food boxes and things. And I really wanted the ambiguity of all the words that could be encompassed in clean to go.
Yeah.
Kickoffs, all sorts of interesting things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But we ended up having to have a whole exchange over email about whether or not the words to go should be hyphenated. And I argued that actually it's incorrect anyway, but she was arguing, well, in American English. But I said, no, but anyway, it takes away all the beautiful ambiguity. And ambiguity can be fantastic, and diversity can be fantastic, and multiple meanings can be fantastic. It's only when we feel we've got to put everything in nice, tidy categories and boxes that it becomes a problem.
Well, you've hit on the classic point at which these things often do get flushed out, which is when you're developing a brand identity. And I think that's something where, if you imagine yourself as the person who's commissioned to draw up the graphic for the logo, you want as clear a brief as you can get from the client, and you actually discover that you are facilitating those conversations in order to get the brief that you need in order to develop the logo. I wondered if I could take this in a slightly different direction, because I noticed that we're talking about contexts of meetings within an organization quite a lot in this, and that's understandable because of the focus of this podcast. And you can imagine an organization as some kind of variation of a pyramid.
Yep.
And somewhere up the line the buck stops. And the circumstances in which I often facilitate are actually not like that. They're shaped like a ring, because I'm facilitating networks where actually it's multiple organizations, and some of them are not even incorporated. Some of them might be very loose. I work a lot in the NGO sector, in the campaigning sector. Yeah. And there's more of so one of the benefits of working in that sector is there's just a little bit more existing literacy in the participants in the meeting about things like degrees of consensus, kind of like agreeing to disagree, because the importance of us working together outshines that. And the freedom that you have if you're, say, for example, an organization that's part of a network or a coalition, to do one thing with the network, with your collaborators, and to do something different independently under your own name. And you might need to have a negotiation about how much that's kind of acceptable. If you're a member of this network, how acceptable is it for you to be doing something independently? But generally, there's a recognition that actually you do the things that benefit from being a collaboration within the collaboration, and you do the things, because collaboration is really hard. It's harder than doing something alone.
Absolutely.
So you only do it when there's actually some real benefit to there being either much bigger numbers, greater resources, the ability to do. In the campaigning sector, people talk about insider outsider kind of approaches to campaigning. So are you actually an advocacy organization that works hand in glove with the people in power and use your influence that way, or are you kind of spiky organization that kind of campaigns by saying grumpy things from the outside? And both of those things can be effective in creating change. And it's recognized that different organizations have different maybe personalities or brand identities, or they have different theories of change, they have different abilities to create change, different competencies, histories, whatever. So that's a different kind of dynamic where it's possible. Actually, you do need 20 people to agree, but it may well be that they only agree about a very small amount of things, or agree close enough. As you say, there's always going to be degrees of that, because they know they've got the freedom to do something independently as well, potentially, or to walk away. And the price of walking away from a coalition, if you're an NGO, is much smaller perhaps than the price of walking away if you are an employee in an organization, where you've got very different kinds of considerations that are much more personal, to do with your livelihood and your status and your career and that kind of thing.
And that's a very interesting distinction. But
I think there's something there about what the price of ultimately not agreeing is, maybe.
In the organizational context, I can instantly see the price of disagreeing would be significantly higher in a significantly shorter time frame. The consequences could become apparent much more quickly than in the networked context that you're describing there. I'm mindful of time here.
Okay.
Because imagine we've been talking for 45 minutes, and it feels like we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes under our belts. There's such rich content coming up at the moment. Can I take us just to bring us into the point of that groan zone? I think we've had a really good groan this morning. The idea of bringing it back into the executives' meeting room, and in the constraint of the organization and the constraint of time, because that, certainly as facilitators, we get it that everybody tends to want to look at the clock, and the facilitator would want to say, if we give it another 10 minutes, we can actually get disproportionate productivity out of that 10 minutes because we've already invested. So what is there advice that we can offer executives about maybe suppressing the personality, maybe suppressing the clock, in the interest of getting better sense of consensus, of giving ourselves a better chance to discover consensus, rather than using the clocks to drive consensus? Is there anything that we can say in summary that might help executives answer that question for themselves?
Where I would go with that is that meetings are incredibly inefficient and expensive. There may be many other ways, apart from getting all sorts of people in a meeting, to get people effectively and efficiently to the marmalade zone. If we can use the tools that nowadays organizations have at their disposal, Slack channels, whatever it might be, to gather people's thoughts beforehand. And somebody was talking to me yesterday about using chatbots for that purpose. For jobs where you used to use a survey, you can now use an AI chatbot to encourage someone to share what they mean by what they say, and gather a whole richness of information beforehand.
Absolutely.
can take things a long way, a lot faster and more efficiently than getting a lot of bodies in a room together. So that would be my instant suggestion. But also, I know that
Really
one
good.
of the things that is most expensive in terms of time and money is when things go wrong.
Mm.
And that this is one of those situations where investing some time up front may well save a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of grief later on.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more, Judy. Really, really well spotted and well articulated. Super. Yeah. Penny, thoughts of wisdom on
I'd like to go back to a point Judy made about not hiding who is actually the decision maker, and I think that's something that I have learned a lot working with public bodies who are kind of consulting with stakeholders before making a decision. Is that sometimes there's this sense of discomfort of saying actually we are the decision maker, and I think in any situation being clear who the decision makers are, you know, if actually yes we do need to make this decision by consensus because everyone is free to walk away, that's one kind of situation. But actually it's going to be me and this other person or this very small group of people who are going to take the decision, but we really want to hear what you have to say, can really help. And also being clear about what's up for grabs, what's open to influence. Actually, these decisions have already been made, and you know, failing extreme political pressure and the front page on the Daily Mail, these decisions are fixed. These are the ones where actually we need your views, and it's useful to talk about. So knowing who the decision maker or decision makers are, whether it's consultation or some other kind of involvement process, and knowing what's open to influence through the conversation. I think those are two really good bits of kind of advanced information that help you plan the meeting much better.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Amazing. And conscious of time, I think, Martin, we should be doing our traditional wrap up, which is brilliantly normally made by your good self.
Yes. So I normally try to do a 1.5 minute summary of just some of the key points that have come up. So if I may, we started off with just articulating 1 or 2 points that people may not know about us, but actually, Penny, your ramble around the coast of England on 2,500 mile journey,
and Wales,
England, Scotland, and Wales. I'm guessing
not Scotland.
Not Scotland yet.
That's really too hard.
But in that journey, you suggested that the rules that you set for yourself can help to bring you into unfamiliar or uncomfortable places, which was a very interesting segue to bring us into the concept of meetings, and actually brought us into clean language and how clean language can be a way to help get us out of the uncomfortable situations by looking to identify shared meaning. Do we actually share the same meaning about the key words that we're using? And if we don't, if we can surface that safely, we have a much better way to get ourselves heading towards consensus. The idea of shared understanding is often elusive because of the language that we use, and clean language can give us a way to unpack that or to unravel that. We then talked about the impact that can have into our institutional memory, and whether it's through staff turnover or inadequate processes of knowledge retention or whatever, our information or our institutional memory can suffer if we don't bottom out some of those differences that arise. One of my big takeaways, Judy, is the quote that you gave us. Driving consensus is an act of coercion. Inviting dissent is an act of collaboration. Now, you quoted a book, Leadership is Language, as the source of that particular piece of wisdom, but that unpacks a whole host of issues. And we talked about personality, culture, hierarchy as potential features of executives or executive teams or organizations that could have a significant impact on that philosophy. The idea of, Penny, you brought us then into the idea of degrees of consensus And you brought us into the concept of networks, let's say loose or semi-formal networks versus the relatively tight hierarchies that naturally exist within organizations. So there can be degrees of consensus, and the implications of not reaching consensus can be significantly different in those two settings. And that brought us back into the corporate boardroom, if I can put it that way, and to say that our final concluding point, and Judy, I think you made this point very eloquently, the inefficiency of meetings and the possibility that we have to better use our time outside meetings to prepare for going into the meetings, so that the time spent within the meetings can actually be a whole lot more productive than our traditional ways of running them. I think we're at time there, Paul. I hope my summary there has done justice to a really, really interesting and rich conversation. And thank you to both of you for it. It was a real joy to take part in that discussion.
Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was an amazing episode. The time flew and I learned so much. Thank you all for being here. I hope our participants also benefit from this episode. We are in episode 4, 2024, our April episode, and hopefully you can join us throughout the year with more insightful conversations like this one. Thank you so much and goodbye, dear guest speakers. Goodbye, Martin.
Thank you.